Of all the locations to feature across the Final Fantasy series, there is perhaps none as iconic, captivating and forbidding as Final Fantasy VII's Midgar, the dystopian sprawl of subterranean slums juxtaposing with the sheen of prosperity above, the blackened blot of decay that it casts on an otherwise vibrant overworld, and the erratic, polarised dispositions of its inhabitants all speak to a city that profoundly shapes the game's setting and the player's overall impression of it. So what are the constituent parts that make Midgar so iconic? How does it inform and propel key aspects of Final Fantasy VII's story? And what is it, after all, that has left such a lasting impression on players over the years? Jumping right in, it's first in some ways useful to define what Midgar is by what it is not, taking ourselves back to the particular time and place of Final Fantasy VII's release and the Final Fantasy titles that had preceded it. There was, up until this point, a clear veneer of European medieval-inspired fantasy informing most of the settings of the games. Even looking to Final Fantasy VI, which many might argue was a blueprint or aesthetic bridge towards what Final Fantasy VII would become, there is still a certain conventional, quote marks, Western style fantasy to its locations, like Castle Figaro, Doma or Jedor, which each employ the wood-beamed cottages and turreted castles found in the earliest games, and more broadly in JRPGs that had been inspired by wizardry, D&D, and all of these forerunners of the genre. In keeping with Midgar's aesthetic distinction, we can look to popular media released in this era that are commonly cited as influences on Final Fantasy VII, if not by the creators themselves. The maturation of the cyberpunk genre through the 1980s and 90s crystallised in novels like William Gibson's Neuromancer and movie adaptations of Blade Runner, Ghost in the Shell, and the seminal Akira, all attest to a thematic and aesthetic zeitgeist that dominated this period, culminating at the end of the decade with pop cultural milestones like Final Fantasy VII and The Matrix. Themes of megacorporations, identity, and artificiality within technology feature across each of these works to some degree or other, but so too does a gritty, brutalist aesthetic with grim alleyways, neon-lit multilingual signage, and poverty-stricken outsiders juxtaposing with the sheen of corporate wealth in many, if not most of these settings. So while art director Yasuki Noora nonchalantly, if comically, suggested that he was inspired by a takeaway pizza in Midgar's design, both the visual and the narrative touchpoints that inform the tone and the structure of the city are undoubtedly born out of a certain dystopian fiction and cultural zeitgeist. And even if we look to early forerunners of what would become cyberpunk, like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, this features a subterranean worker class propping up an elite overworld in a city that stacks buildings on top of buildings. So there is a clear thread here dating back right through the 20th century, if a subtle and subconscious one, of what contributed and ultimately resulted in the style, shape and aesthetic of Midgar in Final Fantasy VII. Finally, on visuals, it's worth noting the small vestiges of reality and early drafts of the game that find their way into the city's design as well. The first draft of Final Fantasy VII was set in a dystopian future New York, not unlike the Neo-Tokyo of Akira, and the story would focus on a character called Detective Joe, among other conceptual names. So while most of this was scrapped and the story ultimately matured and took a completely different direction, I think the feel of a detective film noir can still be felt through Midgar in certain scenes and in certain pre-rendered paintings, with the sharp contrasted lighting of certain alleyways, the bricked terraces, the checkerboard floor patterns, and other such geometric Art Deco flourishes that actually, I think, nod back to the 1920s, 1930s New York vibe that was very popular with hard-boiled detective fiction and pulp magazines in the early 20th century. And honestly, just looking at some of the choice pre-rendered background paintings here, I think because it's the largest location in Final Fantasy VII, almost certainly it has the most pre-rendered environments dedicated to it. A whole study could be done on the pre-rendered backgrounds of Midgar to unpick all of these little elements and flourishes and influences here. Personally, I love examining them and trying to find them in high resolution when I can. And even in researching this episode, I noticed a little nod to Final Fantasy VI, as there's a big billboard that says Mount Colts in the foreground of one of the Sector 8 environments. Moving on from Midgar's unique and groundbreaking design, a second factor of its renown is that we both start the game here and spend such a prolonged amount of time here. And indeed, rather than give us a glimpse of the world map, the overworld, quite early on, as actually most other games in the series do, Final Fantasy VII instead funnels us for several hours through what feels like a lengthy dungeon segment of Midgar's underworld. We are completely locked in to the plight of Avalanche, their bombing campaign through the city, and how this chaotically leads to the meeting with Aerith, Don Corneo's mansion, the storming of Shinra HQ, and all of that stuff. So it's no surprise that some players for whom Final Fantasy VII was their first experience of the series assumed that Midgar might be the entirety of the game. And for my part, I had a similar thing where, believe it or not, I got stuck on Rufus Shinra as a boss as a kid. I loaned Final Fantasy VII to my friend at school, who promptly smashed his way through the opening of the game and told me that he'd escaped from Midgar into the world. And that's when the true scale of Final Fantasy VII actually dawned on me. So, from a purely structural point of view, there was a real sense of focus on Midgar as this gloomy opening stanza of Final Fantasy VII, which thus opens out into the world. And again, thinking about the juxtapositions, thinking about defining Midgar by what it isn't, I think it's no accident that the two neighbouring locations in the grasslands adjacent to Midgar are the scenic town of Calm and Chocobo Bill's farm, which are both this light-hearted reprieve from the gritty danger and bleakness of Shinra's heartland. This narrative structure that locks us into Midgar from the outset is also a fantastic introduction to the world that we are inhabiting. It introduces us succinctly to the domineering villainy of Shinra Corporation, the key players there like Rufus, Hojo, Scarlet and Heidegger, and also the forces that seek to oppose them, and importantly the reasons why they are being opposed. And this is delivered through Barret and Avalanche primarily, along with the nature of Marco as an energy source, and to a lesser extent these ideas surrounding the life stream, which get developed much more at Cosmo Canyon later on. Also, as an aside, I won't labour too much on this point, but I think Nobuo Uematsu's score contributes immensely to the impression that we get in this early portion of the game. Now, admittedly, a lot of the tracks are reused and they're not exclusive to Midgar, but we have some, such as Oppressed People and Under the Rotting Pizza, I think it's called, which are great tracks that are sort of lend to this idea of the sleaziness and the oppression, particularly of the slums sectors of the environment. So in short, it is a concentration of the game's themes and a microcosm reflecting the macro events of the wider world. Just looking at the destitution of those living under the plate at the hands of Shinra, we could see it as a reflection of the other locations in the world that the company has encroached upon, the denizens of Lower Junon, the destroyed town of Corel, and the erasure of Nibelheim, are each testament to the destructive oppression of Shinra that is mimicked by how their citizens are treated in the city itself. Looping back to Yusuke Noura's pizza-inspired design, it's interesting too how this reinforces Shinra's oppression and is subtly delivered through showing rather than telling at the beginning of the game. For example, nowhere does it explicitly say that Shinra is evil in an opening monologue, but rather we have visual, conversational and gameplay set pieces that build up this impression for the player as we play through the opening. Just looking to that memorable opening FMV that shows Aerith exit a gritty alleyway, the camera pulls away through city traffic and up, showing these sectored partitions around the city, and Shinra Tower overlooking everything from the centre, it instantly conveys a sense of an oppressive industrial city. There are no districts or regions or prefectures with historical or meaningful names, because there is no history, there is no real culture. There's just the Shinra company. And indeed, the closest we really get to named locations, particularly below the plate, is places like Wall Market, which again, it enforces this sense of confinement and oppressive partitioning. Looking to infrastructure, we likewise feel the oppression and partitioning of social classes through the security checks undertaken on train journeys and the laborious shuffling around through ventilation ducts and sewers that our party needs to do to actually get through the city undetected. And while in the original game we don't really see much of the citizens living above ground, there are some choice instances, such as the Shinra employee aboard the train, who's terrified of Barrett and surrounded by lowlives. So even though he may not necessarily live above ground, being someone that works above ground, there is this sort of class distinction there that I always found quite interesting. In similar fashion, I love the recurring character model of this spiky-haired, sunglasses-wearing guy that's just Final Fantasy VII's universal sign of a thuggish ne'er-do-well who pops up in several seedy locations, particularly in Midgar, in the slums, that emphasises this disparity of class above and below. Again, it probably warrants a study all of its own, but the NPCs of the Midgar slums are really among the most destitute and nihilistic, and thus, I think, interesting that we see in a given Final Fantasy game. From the guy who's afflicted with macro poisoning to the often debated joint suicide on the train platform, which is a bit of a mistranslation there. It's not intended to be a joint suicide. Even characters like Mayor Domino, once we reach the Shinra headquarters, this elected leader in name only, all of these NPCs, like the architecture and the visual vibe itself, contribute to the feeling of Midgar as a bleak, hopeless city, and once more have helped cement this legacy in the mind of the player. Lastly, just looking at the briefly shown exterior shots of Midgar once we finally escape, we can see how, just like the mythological Midgard, from which it takes its name, it's actually an enclosure. It's an ecosystem unto itself that's hemmed in, and perhaps for the poor at least, those living under the plate, it's actually virtually impossible to leave. So it's not something that's immediately obvious or, again, outrightly discussed in the game, but the prospect of people being trapped within this city helps cement our impression of it. I also think the later stages of the game that show, for example, Rufus Shinra relocating the Sister Ray to Midgar. Even earlier, we have Shinra Senior destroying part of the plate to send a message to Avalanche. It shows that the city itself is like a Lego set for oligarchs and the rich to impose their will on everyone around them. Whether that's President Shinra's vindictive actions in destroying the plate, or Rufus's arguably maybe virtuous, I don't know, actions in trying to get to Sephiroth and ultimately, I think, save the world, if in a very self-interested way. So once more, a lot of narrative and thematic weight that centre around Midgar as the central hub and focus of this game. Moving finally to consider the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I mentioned this back in my review of that game when it was released, but it's interesting to see ways in which Midgar was both brought to life and also altered in the 2020 reimagining of this saga. On the first point, wandering around the city in a real-time 1-to-1 ratio was awesome to see, particularly, I think, the above-the-plate sections that we hadn't previously seen much of in the 1997 game. But conversely, there was also a sense from several players that compared to the original, this reimagining of Midgar felt quite sanitized. Dare I say, it was quite an affable, not entirely awful place to live, even down in the slums, and where the original title had that meanness and dystopian vibe akin to Judge Dredd or Escape from New York or The Warriors and all of these bleak imaginings of a dystopian future city, Final Fantasy VII Remake had a sense of contentment, even among its slum-dwelling citizens, that softened the impression of Midgar considerably. Now, in defence of this, and as I mentioned in my review at the time, I could understand the desire to brighten up Midgar a little bit in both colour and mood, because we spend an entire game there, and if we were trudging through this mean-spirited, bleak cyberpunk city for 60 hours, it might get quite depressing. And indeed, just as a personal and comparable example, I really enjoy the Fallout games. I think they're great. There is something alluring about a free-roaming post-apocalyptic world. But at the same time, when I play Fallout for an extended period of time, I do feel the bleakness start corroding my soul, and I need to step outside for a bit. And ultimately, bleakness and this sort of vibe is not what Final Fantasy is generally about. They have elements of tragedy and sadness, yes, but it's very rarely the mood that it seeks to convey as a constant. And rather, they usually try to deliver on a sense of fellowship, a sense of helping other people, and being a hero in a very grandiose way. And the Midgar of Final Fantasy VII Remake works in service of that. So while yes, the mood is considerably lighter, and yes, finding cats and performing a dance-off isn't exactly what you'd expect in a Midgar of 1997's calibre, but there is certainly a tale of two Midgars at work here, owing largely to the amount of time that we are required to spend in one versus the other, and how Remake sought to mitigate the sense that this world might not be that terrible, is instead of making Midgar itself overwhelmingly bleak, they really dialed up the scenes that featured Shinra executives being vindictive and awful. They very conspicuously showed President Shinra being responsible for the Mako explosion, for example, rather than simply being an inference in the original game. So there we have it. That's a look at the composition and the iconic status of Midgar, its design, its inspiration, and how it's changed over the years as a consequence of the Final Fantasy VII anthology being remade, redesigned, and so on. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon, or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.